A staggering 21 million people are currently estimated to be victims of forced labor worldwide. Domestic work, agriculture, construction, and manufacturing are among the most prevalent sectors, with migrant workers being particularly vulnerable. Let's talk about forced labor and how we can help combat this scourge in global supply chains. At any given moment, approximately 3 out of every 1,000 workers on the planet are suffering from some form of forced labor situation. Forced labor refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work under conditions that they haven't necessarily chosen themselves, whether by the use of violence and intimidation, or through more subtle means, such as the withholding of wages, or through accumulated debt, exorbitant recruitment fees, or the retention of identity papers, like passports, which restrict workers from leaving their workplaces. Global labor supply chains containing multiple levels of contractors and subcontractors, particularly in the developing world, where labor laws are either non-existent or non-enforced, provide fertile ground for forced labor conditions to arise. Traffickers and unscrupulous recruitment agents often prey upon marginalized and less educated workers because their particular circumstances makes them reluctant to seek help from authorities, and their vulnerabilities makes it easier to coerce and manipulate them. These workers are often forced to take out sizable loans to pay recruiters up front for promised jobs in other countries, only to learn that when they get there, that the terms of their contracts have changed, often significantly, and that the job they were originally promised no longer exists. Once they arrive, they often also face dismal working conditions and chronically low wages that will barely cover their ever-mounting interest charges on their loans. The issue of trafficking and forced labor transcends economies and industries. There are victims in both the developed and developing countries, in a wide variety of job settings, including hospitality, construction, apparel, and food production. And it's pervasive. The most recent report from the US Department of Labor lists 139 products produced in 75 different countries that have either used forced labor, child labor, or both. The products include such items as cocoa, electronics, footwear, and even surgical instruments. This is clearly not an isolated problem. It is significant both in terms of its scope as well as its moral implications. So what's the response? Our experience in this area reveals that leading companies are embracing their obligations under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and are taking deliberative steps to help prevent abuses by promoting greater awareness among their supply chains, and implementing effective standards and action plans which support the elimination of forced labor in their supply chains. This is quickly becoming a compliance issue, as governments too are beginning to recognize their obligations to protect human rights and prevent abuses by enacting regulatory legislation, like the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act and the UK Modern Slavery Act, among others, that compel corporate entities to take actions to ensure that they are not responsible for or contributing to forced labor practices in their global operations. Beyond complying with the law, companies are increasingly implementing and updating their codes of conduct and integrating their enterprise risk management systems and programs into their supply chains. Many companies require contractual commitments and other measures from their suppliers that allow for more regular monitoring, auditing, and reporting of their labor conditions with a specific focus on eliminating the potential for trafficking and forced labor within their supply chain. But some key challenges exist. These include the difficulty of detecting and uncovering less visible forms of forced labor and trafficking, the inability to exercise significant influence or control over third-party subcontractors and their suppliers, especially as individual companies, coming to terms with the sheer complexity of supply chain webs and the difficulty of both mapping and policing them, and of course the lack of regulatory oversight and enforcement in many source countries, which are most often among the poorest. In spite of the clear challenges in detecting forced labor, there are certain employment practices at the supplier level which may lead to situations of labor exploitation and should therefore be targeted. Typical elements that buying companies can and should address in their sourcing policies are the implementation of safeguards against such things as the retention of passports, recruitment fees that can lead to worker indebtedness, the withholding of wages, the physical or psychological coercion of workers, and of course, absolutely any restrictions on freedom of movement. It's also important that workers have clear terms of employment before entering into an employment relationship with a supplier, and not just some empty assurances from recruitment agencies. So, how can we help? This is obviously a complex area, and Interpraxis actively supports companies in addressing issues around forced labor and supply chains. Not only do we help companies fulfill their compliance and disclosure obligations with relevant regulations, we also help companies to review their codes and systems against international best practice, to identify any gaps and ensure that robust supplier requirements are in place. We also work with suppliers to help them implement appropriate safeguards so that we can help coordinate a joined-up approach where together we can all help to reduce risks and eradicate the scourge of forced labor in the supply chain around the globe.